Lady Jane Grey is often depicted as a pawn, a tragic figure forced to bear a crown she didn't want, a tool in the hands of her parents and John Dudley. But that's just not true. Now, we know that Jane didn't seek the throne. She was shocked on receiving news that the king was dead and that she was to be queen. She wept, declaring, "The crown is not my right and pleases me not. The Lady Mary is the rightful heir." But when she was told that the king had expressly chosen her as his successor, she accepted it as her destiny, as God's will and plan for her, telling later how she turned herself to God, praying and beseeching him, and I quote, "that if what was given to me was rightfully and lawfully mine, his divine majesty would grant me such grace and spirit that I might govern it to his glory and service and to the advantage of this realm." In her book on the Grey sisters, the sisters who would be queen, Leanda de Lisle writes of how, when Mary's letter to the council declaring her queenship brought Jane's mother and mother-in-law to panicked tears, Jane put on a brave face. De Lisle explains, like Joan of Arc, who defended France at the age of 17, she would protect her country and her faith against the threat she believed Mary posed. Jane had notices pinned up across the city of London, proclaiming the late king's will that she be queen and denouncing Mary for planning to introduce the Pope into English affairs. She signed herself on these notices as Jane the Queen, and she was far from being Northumberland's puppet or figurehead. She embraced her queenship. She made decisions about what title her husband should have, Duke rather than King, organised munitions and men to march against Mary, and on hearing news of the mutiny of her ships, ordered a curfew for the City of London, wrote letters to sheriffs and justices of the peace demanding their allegiance, and ordered a guard to be mounted around the Tower of London and for the keys to be delivered to her. She wrote of the malicious purposes of those siding with Mary, threatening such punishment and execution as they deserve. When it was clear that she'd lost the crown, that Mary was victorious, Jane was recorded as being sorrowful, but bearing the ill fate with great valour and endurance. She was moved from the royal apartments to the house of a gentleman jailer, Nathaniel Partridge, while her husband, Lord Guildford Dudley, was imprisoned in the Beauchamp Tower, where he was soon joined by his brothers and father, as well as William Parr, Marquess of Northampton, and Jane's father, the Duke of Suffolk. Suffolk was soon released, though, following Jane's mother's pleas to the new queen for clemency for her family. The Duke of Northumberland was executed in August 1553 after being found guilty of high treason. But it appeared that Mary might just spare Jane. However, Jane didn't play ball. Instead of being the model prisoner, she made it clear that she was appalled by the new Queen's religious policies and news that the Mass was once more being celebrated openly in London. Jane was tried for high treason along with Guildford, his brothers Ambrose and Henry, and Archbishop Thomas Cranmer on the 13th of November 1553. They were all found guilty and sentenced to death. But Mary didn't move to kill Jane, and the following month Jane was given more freedom at the Tower, being allowed to walk in the Queen's garden. It was thought that Mary planned to pardon her and release her into house arrest at Bradgate Park, the Grey family home in rural Leicestershire. But Jane made this plan impossible. As her biographer Eric Ives notes, Jane appears to have seen her imprisonment as a test of her election by God. She was fully prepared to die and for her death to have real meaning. She used her imprisonment to study the Bible, to pray and to write letters. And these weren't ordinary letters. She spoke out against the Catholic faith, going so far as to damn all those who attended Mass. In a letter to her former tutor, Dr. Thomas Harding, who'd turned away from Protestantism and embraced Catholicism, she called him the deformed imp of the devil and referred to the Catholic faith as the whore of Babylon and the abominable idol. She also wrote of how Christ came not to bring peace, but a sword, and that people should return again unto Christ's war. She was inciting rebellion, and it was rebellion that would be her undoing. Now, Jane wasn't actually involved in Wyatt's rebellion, a rebellion that broke out in early 1554 and which sought to depose Mary and to replace her with Elizabeth, but Jane's father was. As news reached the royal council that the rebels were advancing on London, Mary signed Jane and Guildford's death warrants. But even after she'd signed Jane's death warrant, Mary still offered Jane the hope of life. Her planned execution on the 7th of February was postponed till the 9th due to the rebels reaching Knightsbridge. But then Jane was granted a 3-day reprieve, and Mary sent her own chaplain and confessor, Dr. John Feckenham, to visit Jane in the hope of persuading her to recant and join the Catholic fold. It's not clear whether Mary was still planning on being merciful to Jane at this point, or whether she was simply trying to save Jane's soul. But again, Jane didn't play ball. She decided to record her exchanges with Feckenham for posterity, with a view to them being published and circulated. Leander de Lisle writes that Jane and Feckenham engaged in lengthy discussions about salvation and about whether Christ was truly present in the consecrated bread and wine. Jane did not waver. She held firmly to her Protestant beliefs and told Feckenham plainly that if he continued along the path of Catholicism, he would go to hell. She prayed for him. Feckenham must have found the situation deeply frustrating. Yet he was also moved by Jane. He asked that she be pardoned. Others were far less sympathetic. Members of the Queen's Council, including Bishop Stephen Gardiner, pressed for Jane's execution. She was, after all, a Protestant traitor in their eyes, and rumours were circulating that rebels were invoking Jane's name and her claim to the throne in renewed attempts to depose the Queen. The Spanish ambassadors, too, urged Mary to act decisively. And in one sermon, Gardiner argued that the Queen should show mercy to her realm and her people, not to a traitor. On the final night of her life, Jane wrote a last letter to her father. In it, she insisted on her innocence of treason, for she had never sought the crown. But she also expressed her joyful anticipation of her heavenly throne. She wrote too to her sister Catherine, urging her not to take what Jane saw as the easy path of conversion to Catholicism, which she believed would damn her soul. Instead, Jane encouraged her sister to put her full trust in God and even to rejoice in Jane's death, as Jane herself did, because it meant eternal life. It is extraordinary to think that a 15 or 16-year-old girl stood her ground against a man like Feckenham, and that she wrote with such certainty and conviction to her family on the eve of her execution. When Jane received a message from her husband Guildford asking to see her one last time so that they might kiss and embrace, she refused. She did not want to be distracted from her spiritual preparation for death. She assured him that they would, as she put it, meet shortly elsewhere. On the 12th of February 1554, Guildford was led from the Tower to the scaffold on Tower Hill and beheaded. His body was carried in a cart to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, and Jane witnessed his body being taken there. Shortly afterwards, Jane herself was escorted from her lodgings to a scaffold near the White Tower. She prayed as she walked. On the scaffold, she declared that she sought salvation only through God's mercy, and she asked those present to pray for her. She was then beheaded, and her body, like her husband's, was taken to the chapel. And so ended the life of a young woman who was spirited, intelligent, and unwavering in her faith. Whatever our views of her beliefs, it's difficult not to be struck by her courage, her resolve, and the calm certainty with which she met her end. Jane was remarkably tough, but Mary was too. And in my next video, we'll shift focus to Mary and the resilience that carried her to the throne.